Welcome back. This is session 2 of this day-long discussion of the Constitution and political economy, and specifically of reviving essentially a constitutional political economy, a progressive constitutional political economy. So let me draw, before I introduce my esteemed colleagues on this panel, let me draw a few strands through from this morning's session, because the book that Joey and Willie have brought forth, and in many ways the argument that they're attempting to launch right now or participate in is one that sort of has 3 aims. One, or envisions a constitutional political economy, a progressive one, as having kind of 3 aims. One is preventing oligarchy, a super concentration of power that basically obviates democracy. Secondly, distributing wealth and power enough that people can actually be equal citizens with some level of equal dignity and equal power in the political process. And last but not least, building a truly inclusive society that overcomes historic white supremacy, settler colonialism, and creates a true democracy, which we've never fully had in the United States. So I just want to remind you that all of those features are ones that point at the carceral state as one of the most disturbing features in our environment. And we don't often think of the carceral state, at least right off the top, as being sort of part of political economy, although there are many people on this panel that have tried to change that perception over the years. But let me remind you, oligarchy, can you think of anything more oligarchic than the carceral state itself? Think of the power of prosecutors, of police to be laws unto themselves, and also thinking of David Graywell's earlier point, to very much influence the people through the newspapers, through their lock on the media, through their control of local politics. Wealth and power, we finally are recognizing that mass incarceration is also a capitalism, that it has been a form of redistributing wealth away from communities of color, of further disintegrating their assets in order to encourage gentrification and other features. And of course, the burden of the carceral state, not just those people in prison, but their loved ones who essentially are paying into the bail system, paying into the prison food system. We don't actually feed people enough and so their families have to pay. There is a major wealth transfer aspect. I need not point really to the effect of mass incarceration on the lack of inclusiveness in our society, because probably its best known feature is the way in which it's resegregated so much of America, or helped to reassert racial meanings at a time when we were beginning to dismantle them. So I hope you'll agree that this is a central topic for a progressive constitutional political economy. To help me think about that, to help us think about that, I've got a fabulous panel that I'm going to introduce basically in the order that they're going to speak. And going to my left here, Devon Carbado, UCLA Law School, who's been one of our greatest scholars on especially race and the Fourth Amendment, the way racial profiling is essentially constitutionalized by our court-centered approach to the Constitution. Following Devon will be our colleague Loïc Wacquant from the sociology department. Loïc is an internationally renowned scholar of ethnography and the carceral state. He's probably done more than anyone to sort of make the issue of punishment an issue of political economy in the current period of time. Following Loïc, we'll hear from Jon Powell. Jon has been at Berkeley Law School. He's the director of our Othering and Belonging Institute, that is Berkeley's Othering and Belonging Institute. He's also, as you probably know, a visionary thinker about political economy, law, and race, and its relationship to the carceral state. And then last but definitely not least, our colleague Ian Haney-Lopez, who has been a professor here at Berkeley Law, and he's, of course, a very renowned scholar of both law and race, and most recently, the politics of race and class. I think he was waving around a copy of the book, Merge Left, which is a very important document. So let me kick this off by asking Devon to start us off. And again, each person will talk for hopefully under 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up.
Great, thank you very much for that. I'm delighted to be participating in this conversation about law and a political economy, whose point of departure is a really outstanding book, outstanding at the level of historical excavation, outstanding at the level of doctrinal exegesis, outstanding at the level of political theory and economic analysis as well. I mean, there's so much that we could say about this book. Our particular charge, of course, is to think about a third reconstruction with respect to the criminal legal system to query whether we might get beyond the war on drugs. I want to focus my specific comments on policing, and more specifically on racialized policing. The basic point that I want to make, I think, is very simpatico with the project of this particular convening, which is to say that we should take up the question of race and policing structurally. No one will be surprised to learn that I'm advancing that particular claim. And in the context of doing so, we should attend not only to matters of law and political economy, but to matters of law and abolition as well. There are multiple ways in which one might describe a structural account of policing. The one that I will offer, I should say, as a caveat, is decidedly, one more time, decidedly incomplete. It's provisional, it's tentative, but I hope it will have identified at least some of the moving parts that should be included in any structural analysis of policing. So my starting point for this particular account is the observation that repeated police interactions are violence exposing, socially controlling, suspect status producing, and carceral entrapping. To put all of this another way, repeated police interactions increases a group's exposure to police violence, increases a group's vulnerability to social control and discipline, increases the salience of the group as criminally suspect, and increases the likelihood that those group members will have a carceral experience. Assuming that I'm right in the foregoing respects, it might be helpful for us to sit back and ask something like the following question. Precisely what are some of the social forces that stages interactions between the police on the one hand and, let's say, Black people on the other? The answer that I will offer, again, as a tentative one, is a story about race and political economy within which law is performing constitutive work. The political economy story that I have in mind resides at the intersection of economic, political powerlessness, racial segregation, mass criminalization. And it seems to me that we pay too little attention to mass criminalization, by which I mean not only the criminalization of relatively non-serious activities, but also the diffusion of criminal justice actors, criminal justice norms, criminal justice logics and practices to other domains of the welfare state. So an easy example is, of course, police officers in schools. So again, the economy story that I'm interested in is economic inequality, political powerlessness, racial segregation, mass criminalization, capital accumulation, and the historical precedent of mobilizing policing as a constitutionalized mechanism of racial subordination. The points I want to stress against that backdrop is really twofold. One is, again, these social factors, each of which are themselves structures, converge to make interactions between Black people and the police a fait accompli. Second, paying attention to those factors transcends accounts about whether particular police officers in particular instances engage in particular forms of misconduct against particular Black people. That's an awful lot of particulars, I know, but that's precisely the point, that we should step back from these particulars and think about this problem more structurally. Now, pause for a minute and think about the ways in which law might be performing work. And I want to focus on two areas of law in this respect. One is equal protection doctrine, and the other is Fourth Amendment doctrine. Both of these construct juridical fields that are political economy instantiating. So let's start with equal protection doctrine. Central to the political economy of equal protection doctrine, it seems to me, is a focus not just on individual forms of misconduct, but also on atomizing forms of racial remediation. So these two features of equal protection doctrine, focusing on individual misconduct and individual forms of remediation, help to constitutionalize and not just naturalize various forms of background inequality, including economic marginality, again, political powerlessness, and racial subordination. In that regard, one might say that equal protection doctrine constitutionalizes a racialized form of oligarchy, consistent with the theme of the book. That constitutionalization is effectuated through a number of moves, including just four that I want to name. One, because quote unquote racial disparities cannot be tied to individual forms of bad conduct, a la intentional discrimination, racial disparities exist beyond the remedial reach of constitutional law. Second, quote unquote, societal discrimination is too, quote unquote, amorphous to have constitutional legibility, so there's nothing that we can do about it. Three, racial mediation is a form of reverse discrimination, and this is a point in which liberals and progressives yes too frequently. So that for liberals, the question is that reverse discrimination justified? Conservatives say no, liberals say yes, but there's a convergence that it's reverse discrimination, which is problematic. Fourth, color consciousness, but not color blindness, causes racial antagonism, racial division, racial contestation, and racial balkanization. The preceding four ideas are not just normative, they're not just discursive, they're also crucially for our purposes distributive. On the one hand, those ideas reproduce, legitimize, and maintain an economic, political, and racial hierarchical ordering, precisely the kind of ordering that makes contact between Black people and the police, again, inevitable. On the other hand, those very same ideas circumscribe the ways in which one might resist. They circumscribe how one might resist by way of litigation, and circumscribes how one might resist in terms of social movement on the other. Let's turn very quickly now to Fourth Amendment law before I stop. As many of you know, Fourth Amendment law is supposed to impose constitutional constraints on police investigatory practices. But for Black people, we experience the amendment more as a regime that authorizes social control, discipline, and violence. Part of the problem with Fourth Amendment law, and the details I won't go into because in a book, which you should probably take a look at and read. I don't see anyone taking pictures of this book, so I'll make it more insistent. Go buy it. But it's a little cheek of me since I haven't even made the arguments yet. But look, so part of the argument the book makes is that at the front end of policing, Fourth Amendment law facilitates police contact by making it easy for police officers to engage people with little or no justification. On the back end, it's the case that Fourth Amendment law makes it easy for police officers to enact violence against people on the thinnest of justifications. So that's the basic takeaways. Again, you need to get the book to really understand that argument in further detail. The power Fourth Amendment law allocates in that regard has implications for how we might think about abolition. So here's what I want to say in that regard. So I've suggested that we should think beyond good and bad cops. What we should be thinking about instead, it seems to me, is forms of police power, drawing from the feminist insight that police officers are not born police officers, they become police officers. And if we take that injunction seriously, then again, it's going to direct us to particular forms of police. So these are just some limited ways in which one might disaggregate out police power and think about how police officers come into being with respect to them. We could have a conversation, of course, about whether the officer goes, about whether police officers go, and some of us can't necessarily get our head around precisely that conversation. So let's take that off the table just for a minute and think instead about police power, and then ask ourselves whether we want to get rid of qualified immunity. There's consensus across the ideological spectrum that should be, if you like, abolished. We could think about abolitionism with respect to other sites of police power as well. So now I'm not talking about the officer per se, or even the institution exactly, but I am talking about the forms of power through which police officers come into being as a site for an abolitionist ethic. One can think about this particular idea with even more granularity by thinking now about, let's say, the power of arrests. I mean, the power of arrest carries with it enormous authority to engage in other activities that are ultimately violence producing. Again, should we get rid of these forms of power. Those are, well, that's not my slide. I'm not sure.
It's a great slide.
It's a brilliant slide. The point I'm trying to make, and we'll and that I'll close with, is that thinking about the political economy of law in the policing domain requires us to ask very specific questions about what other forms of power that state actors like police officers exercise, and can we target an abolitionist ethic with respect to them? I worry that progressives and liberals have been too quick to take the issue of abolition off the table before it's even articulated. I don't pretend to have the imaginative capacity to understand what abolitionism might mean all the way down, but I'm interested in engaging it. And so I would ask that as we think about political economy and law, that we not poo-poo this. Liberals tend to poo-poo things too quickly in ways that end up leaving the terrain as it is in place, and that in effect produce precisely this conversation that we're having right now, is where is the political economy of that? So I'll stop there and turn it over to Loïc.
Well, thank you. I regret that I didn't ask to speak before Devon, because it's a hard act to follow. I'm not as eloquent as he is. So in the half century, I've entitled my remarks, Taking Down the Penal State, 4 Cautions. And I'll just remind people that in the half century following the ebbing of the civil rights movement, the US has built a gargantuan penal state that has remade race and citizenship. And to take down this penal state, one needs a sober diagnosis of its rise, its roots, and its configuration. And I will put 4 propositions or cautions that can guide the legislative and constitutional work needed to take down this penal state. I will not ridicule myself by making legal arguments and even less constitutional arguments, but I hope that my pointers can stimulate such arguments. So first argument, the illusion of retreat. The American penal state is still growing more punitive as we speak. The inmate population has been decreasing slowly since reaching its peak of 2.3 million in 2008. It has come down to just about 2 million on the eve of the pandemic, a decline of 15% by 2019. But during those 13 years, the volume of crimes decreased by 27%. This means that the number of inmates per 1,000 crimes has risen from 2019 inmates to 219 inmates to 254 inmates, an 8% increase in punitiveness. Second point, the most powerful predictor of incarceration is not race, but class. The focus on in the public debate, driven by arguments such as the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, has been relentlessly on race. But the primary determinant of incarceration is class. As one who has written extensively on race and hyper-incarceration, I cannot be accused of minimizing the role of race, but the facts are overwhelming. The population behind bars, Black, white, and Latino, is composed nearly exclusively of sub-proletarian men mired in economic precarity, cultural destitution, and social marginality. Let me give you some indicators of the profile of the prison inmates in America today. 85% of state prisoners have only a high school education or less, as against 3% a college degree, compared to about half the adult population in the United States. A paltry 14% were married, compared to half of the general population. 1 in 5 convicts had lived in public housing, although public housing accounts for only 1% of the total housing stock in this country. And nearly half reported growing up in a single-parent household, as against 23% for the national average. 42% had parents or guardians who received welfare, and an astounding 17% had lived in a foster home, agency, or institutions 8 times the national rate. To top it all, some 59% had family members who had been incarcerated, including 21% a father only and 37% a sibling. In short, there are no middle-class prisoners in America, as is the case in other advanced societies. The penitentiary is a reservation for the precariat, regardless of color. Second point, under this heading of the question of class, is if you compare the class disparity and the racial disparity in incarceration. The black-white disparity in incarceration reached its apex in 1993 with a ratio of 9-1. So blacks were 9 times more likely than whites to be incarcerated. And it has dropped in 2015 to 3-1. This is, I base here my figures in a remarkable article by my young colleague, Chris Muller, and one of his students, Alec Rorkas, which was published in Social Forces last year, which looks at the transformation of class and racial disparity in incarceration, including the period since 2000, so up to 2015. Second, there's a deep class disparity within the African-American population. As incarceration ballooned around century's turn, the probability of imprisonment for Black lower-class men with less than a high school education doubled from 20% to 37%. But the probability of imprisonment for Black middle-class men, men with some college education, decreased by 27% between 1980 and 2000. So the result is that the class disparity in incarceration among Black men jumped from 1 to 6 in 1990 to 1 to 17 20 years later. Third point, the model punishment is not prison, but probation. Attention to the prison distracts us from the fact that criminal punishment in the US takes the form primarily of non-custodial sentences, even in the case of low-level felonies, which routinely result in a probation sentence. If you look at the correctional population of 7.4 million in 2017, which has decreased today to 2.6 million, you will see that there's 1.5 million people in prison, 738,000 in jail, for a total of 2.1 million behind bars, but there's 4.4 million under probation, twice the carceral population. And then there's 879,000 on parole. So why focus on the 4.4 million probationers? And I think Devon gave us part of the answer. First, because there are twice the number of people behind bars, but also because only half of probationers complete their stint under probation successfully, meaning that, and many probationers are out there with, quote, years hanging over their heads, as the prosecutors put it, meaning if they violate the terms of their probation, they can be sent back into a carceral institution, and it's quick and cheap to send an offender to prison by way of probation or parole violation than it is to prosecute a new case. So, you know, I carried out a 2.5-year ethnographic observation of 2 criminal county courts in Northern California, in 2 counties that shall remain unnamed. And in one of those, the prosecutor says, I would love to have the total population under probation. So it matters because being on felony probation in particular, people on felony probation are typically subjected to 4-way search clauses, meaning that the police can stop them without cause or motive and search their person, their belongings, their car, and their residence. This makes it easier to detect minor technical violations of probation, as well as possession of drugs, weapons, stolen merchandise, but also to catch mundane violations of probation or parole, such as, for instance, being in a location for which one has a stay-away order, or sharing a room or riding in a car with a person who is also a parolee, who typically is forbidden under parole rules. Fourth point that I want to make is draw attention to place, and particularly policing and places of punishment. Penalization is extraordinarily selective by neighborhood. In all advanced societies, the penal state targets urban neighborhoods that are at once dispossessed and defamed, poor and stigmatized. In the US, that is the hyper-ghetto, or the remnants of the communal ghetto of the Fordist era, doubly segregated by race and class and devoid of economic function and institutional buffers. The extraordinary clustering of incarceration by place matters because it explains how the imprisonment rate of middle-class Blacks could decrease at the same time as the rate for lower class blacks boomed. This class selectivity inside of race is achieved by the policing and judicial targeting of the vestiges of the dark ghetto and assorted poor and segregated areas in the jewel city. So if you take the example of Chicago and you draw a map of race and poverty and incarceration and prisoner reentry, you obtain essentially the same map. The historic core of the South Side and West Side are by far the two zones with the highest number of convicts per residence, and the ranking of the city's 77 community areas based on that indicator proves highly stable over time for the period 1990 to 2005. Now, these neighborhoods were targeted not because they are Black, but because they are poor, dilapidated, stigmatized, suffering as they do from decades of high crime, economic involution, and social disinvestment. They are seen as urban sores that fester and threaten the health of the city, the redoubt of the racialized, quote, underclass. For those of you who want a genealogy of this notion, I just wrote a book called The Invention of the Underclass. So I don't have the cover to show, but I invite you to read this book. And this underclass, which needs to be brought under the stern tutelage by forceful action of the state. And as a result, their residents are easy prey for tactics of hardline policing and punitive prosecution, leading to mass arrest and expedited sentencing. And here I'm going to amplify some of the points that Devon just made. The hyperghetto is the dream territory for aggressive law enforcement skirting the bounds of legality. Crime on the streets is prevalent and visible. The residents are vulnerable because so many are on probation or parole and already have a criminal record. They also do not possess the economic and cultural capital needed to post bail or litigate their case. Moreover, their precarious life circumstances make it impossible for them to delay the resolution of their judicial matter. For instance, they could lose their low-wage jobs if they stay locked up in remand detention, or if they keep absenting themselves to attend court hearings. The result is that people in the hyperghetto are easy to charge, if only for violating their probation or their parole, and they will take an early deal from the district attorney and plead guilty to reduced charges to get out of jail post-hate, setting themselves up for the next round of arrest and prosecution. And prosecutors like to say, there's an expression in one of the counties, they say when people are behind bars and in jail, and they are eager to get out of jail very quickly, and they know that that they're going to have to plead, so they plead very quickly. The prosecutor says, all you have to do is to jangle the jail keys and tell them you can sleep in your own bed tonight. So I made my 4 points. Let me briefly recapitulate them. First, beware of carceral optics that suggests that the penal state is being rolled back. It is getting more punitive. Bring class back in. Focus on low-level punishment, community sanction, probation, and bring place into the equation. Now, quid of constitutionality. I see two levers or two avenues to connect constitutional debates to this diagnosis. Is first, regulate policing differently. And in particular, the debates on the Fourth Amendment are very key. There is pressure from the prosecutorial side across the US to make, so the four-way searches is, you can search the person, search their belonging, search their car, and search their house. There's pressure to make four-way search, five-way searches, and to allow the police to search people's phone without cause or motive. So, the regulation of policing, which is the source of 90% of the racial disparity in conviction and incarceration, doesn't come from the courts being biased. It comes from essentially from policing. Second, focus on constitutional biases in the administration of probation. And third, elevate place as a protected characteristic by anti-discrimination legislation, discrimination by neighborhood, discrimination by zip code. This is a protected category by the anti-discrimination legislation in a number of European countries, among them France. And I think that's an avenue worth exploring. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's good to be on this panel. Good to be sitting here with you. And thank you for the book, for the conversation. So I'm going to focus more on Reconstruction. And I pulled up, if I can get it on my phone, I pulled up something by Eric Foner. I'm sure all of you know. Okay, this is from his book, The Second Founding. Also, I think the title itself is provocative because he's suggesting, like others, that we really have two different foundings. And there was an attempt to actually make a break between the two foundings. And so from his book, and I'll just read you two paragraphs. Nonetheless, ingrained racism undermined the value of Dunning School scholarship. Dunning actually was one of the first scholars who actually wrote about Reconstruction and was the dominant frame for thinking about Reconstruction until the 1950s. So this was something that influenced not only the public, but also the courts. Dunning School of Scholarship, convinced that Blacks lacked the capacity to participate intelligently in political democracy. They condemned Reconstruction, in the words of Dunning's Columbia colleagues, Joe Burgess, for imposing the rule of uncivilized Negroes over the whites of the South, inevitably producing an orgy of corruption and misgovernment. This portrayal of Reconstruction became part of the lost cause ideology that permeated the Southern culture in the first half of the 20th century and was reflected in the proliferation of Confederate monuments that still dot the Southern landscape and have lately become the source of strident debate. Along with the nostalgia image of Confederacy, the idea of the lost cause rested on the view that slavery is a benign, paternalistic institution, and of Reconstruction as a time Negro rule from which the South has been rescued by the heroic action of self-styled redeemers who restored white supremacy. So the story, and part of what I want to talk to you about is stories. So this notion that whites were abused by Reconstruction, and the country eventually came to this notion that they're abused by Blacks. And now we're in the second Reconstruction and the backlash. And the story is that of racial resentment. So we have all these stories about white resentment and the excesses of civil rights, even as it wasn't implemented. And this is the large discourse, I think, again, Devon, when you're talking about trying to get liberals and progressives to talk about what's going on, and the notion that we can only go so far. It's also important to sort of think about this in different terms. So I'm thinking specifically of Anthony Mark's work, Making Race, Making Nation, where he compares South Africa, the United States, and Brazil. What he talks about is the role of race in making those nations, making race, making nations. So when we talk about race, we're not talking specifically about Black people. We're talking about the making of the United States, how the role that race played in terms of making the country. And I said, there's another way of thinking about this, of making the other, making the self. Making the other, making the self. So what am I talking about here? What I want to suggest to you is that race making, and particularly anti-Black race making, is what actually created whiteness, the ideology of whiteness. And that's at the core of what we're talking about. And the backlash that comes from the first Reconstruction, and then the second, is the disturbance of the white dominance that was part of the nation making. And so the strategy is, how do we actually have a progressive civil rights inclusive movement without disturbing white dominance? Of course, we can't. And sort of until we take that on, not in the form of challenging white people or people who are categorized as white, but the edifice of those reflected in the panel in the morning. We talked about electoral college, we talked about apportionment, we talked about all these mechanisms in place that in many ways was designed to sort of make whiteness in relationship to Blackness, and then to control Blackness in relationship to whiteness. So we need a more complicated story, not a story simply about discrimination or bias, but about nation making, about people making, if you will. And a lot of people say we're going through this period because of changing demographics and other things of an existentialist crisis, which I think is right in some level, but also think is too little. Because really what we're going through is an ontological crisis. What it means to be American, what it means to be white in America is undergoing change. And I think people are experiencing that even if they can't name it. And they're calling upon the courts and others to really protect their declining whiteness. And so a lot of times this effort, especially around the political economy, is how do we actually align Black interests and white interests? I want to cite a couple of people for this, including my friend and former colleague, Derek Bell. So Bell basically talked about in terms of interest conversion, and Ian was one of his students, that Black and white interests could not converge, or they converge only for a little while, and then they diverged, and you had a backlash. And I wrote, partially in critique of what Bell was saying, is that he's right and he's wrong. He's right in the sense that that interest does converge, but what he's wrong in is to assume that interest is stable. The interest is not stable. It's actually subject to intervention, and it's not all whites. And so to look for those fissions, look for those opportunities where it's divergent is part of our work. But what the left more often does is just assume that the interest is aligned. If you're working class white and you're working class Black, you have the same interest. And people who actually embrace that obviously are not students of Du Bois, because Du Bois talked about the wages of whiteness. And he was saying the wages was not exclusively, in some cases, not even primarily material. It was a psychological wage. I would say it's an ontological wage. It's something that actually constitutes whiteness. And in the book, I don't have a picture of my book either, but I talk about you.
Oh my goodness.
I know.
Do you want to borrow my book?
Yes.
Yeah.
So in Racing to Justice, I talk about you can't expect the people to go through an ontological death. And so even if whiteness is constructed in this dominant, destructive way, which creates all this anxiety, what's the alternative? We haven't been serious about creating a different white identity that's not predicated on domination and anti-Blackness. And I think until we do that, we won't succeed. And I think what the court has done and what conservatives have done is try to protect that identity, which is again, there are a lot of forces that are actually calling into questions. Robert Sapolsky in Behave reminds us that many wars, if not half of them, have been fought over what he calls sacred symbols. Sacred symbols. So when we say something is just symbolic, from Sapolsky's perspective, it doesn't mean it's unimportant. And what makes it sacred is not that it was given from God. What makes it sacred is that our identities are closely tied to it. And teaching some of this stuff is interesting. Talking about political economy, to remind students that the Lochner era and the Jim Crow era is the same era, same court. So as the court sort of liberalizing the expression of the economy for corporations and the elites, is unable to find any solace for the freed slaves, even under the Civil War amendments. And again, going back to the 14th Amendment, which I won't spend too much time on, the heart of the 14th Amendment was not equality. The heart of the 14th Amendment was citizenship, was belonging. And the court just eviscerated that. It made national citizenship meaningless. The other part of it was a restructuring, which we're talking about today, the relationship between the federal government and states. Again, eviscerated that. We're back to, I think about the voting rights case, we're back to the supremacy of the states in favor of states imposing limitations on the participation of the freed slaves in the polity. And I'm the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute. And I was talking to a colleague and saying, belonging is predicated on the notion that everyone counts, that everyone has dignity. So I start from the premises that there's certain truths that are self-evident, that all people belong, except all people, right? That everyone has human dignity. And so we can debate what Jefferson meant when he said that in the Declaration of Independence. But I think where we're trying to get to is the notion that all people belong. But we can't get there unless we do at least two things. Really grapple with the role of whiteness and the anxiety of whiteness that the court and the society keeps coming back to whenever Blacks seem to make progress. And the part of that is because Blackness is defined in opposition to whiteness. So it's a zero-sum game. If Black gains, there's a sense of white loss, and not, again, just material loss, but also of emotional and ontological loss, of status loss. So how might we do this? And I think what we try to do at the Other Way Belonging Institute is try to make it clear that we're not talking about trading one dominance for another dominance, saying the thing that's really pernicious about white dominance and white supremacy, which Ian writes a lot about, is not the whiteness part of it, it's the dominance part of it. It's the assumption that one group should dominate over another group. And then two last points. So I want to talk about 4 boxes twice, so 8 boxes altogether. Susan Fiss from Princeton, she writes about stereotype content threat. And she basically says one axis is an axis of how much you like somebody. The second axis, how competent you think they are. And with that, she produces 4 boxes. And one box, you like someone, you think they're competent. That's sort of the gold standard. Another box, you like someone, but you don't think they're competent. Another box, you don't like someone, and you don't think they're competent. And in sort of generating these 4 boxes, she then plots out where do different populations in the United States and around the world fall on these boxes. And what she says, and this is empirical, that when a group actually falls into dislike, don't think they're competent, they're not seen as human. At a unconscious level, when you see someone that you don't like and you don't think they're competent, at a deep level, we don't see that person as human. And I've written that you can't develop effective policy for people that you don't see as human. And the reason this is important is that it actually helps us distribute how different marginalized groups show up in the national imagination. And for the most part, again, Blacks are not seen as human, which is what a lot of this debate has been around. So what are the other 4 boxes? Well, one of the big debates in constitutional law and beyond is public and private, and the court's role in terms of addressing public and private, especially in the context of the Civil War amendments, the Reconstruction amendments. Is the 14th Amendment equality about equal in the public sphere or the private sphere? What rights do we have in the public sphere and the private sphere? And so a lot of debate is about whether or not something is in one of those spheres and the proper adjudication if someone is in those spheres. And there's a long article that I've written about this and a little bit complicated. I won't get into all of it. But the spheres are badly conceptualized for a lot of reasons. I will say this private sphere largely comes from Protestant Lutheranism. And the idea was that you go into the private sphere and you commune with God as you're a Protestant. And that was the most sacred space you could be in. And so once we remove God, you're just going into a private sphere by yourself. And so that became a very sacred space. And even though we don't talk about God anymore, we still see the private as sacred. Government should leave us alone. What we've done is to put corporations in the private sphere. And once we put corporations in the private sphere, we essentially push people out of the private sphere. So corporations should not be in the private sphere. Where should they be? Well, let's talk about the other 2 spheres. So there's private, public. A third sphere is non-public, non-private. And the 4th sphere is corporate. So those 4 spheres should operate differently in our society. So what's a non-public, non-private sphere? Historically, that's where people enslaved, that's where women, homeless, You don't have any public protection. You don't have any private protection. You're the most marginal in society. And so what we have right now is an expanding of the non-public, non-private. Have really a shrinking of the private for people and an expanding of private for corporations. And it distorts things. So again, going back to Lochner, we see that the more solicitous the court is to corporations, the less it is to people. And that's sort of the thing that's going back and forth, back and forth. And I'll end just by saying this. I think race properly understood explains a lot of what's going on. And so you look at the backlash of the second Reconstruction happened within a couple of years. So you have Nixon, you have Wallace, you have Reagan, all sort of actually leaning toward and appealing to white resentment. The whole Southern strategy is to appeal to white resentment. And we get confused. Why are white people who are not necessarily corporate aligning themselves with Nixon? Whiteness as a concept, as a construct, was not the elites. Whiteness was the middle stratum. Again, there were the elites who were not white. They were English and French. They were European. They were not white. I want to emphasize that. Whites were the middle stratum, and their role was allegiance to the elites and dominance over the slaves, of those enslaved. And you still have remnants of that now. There's still sort of, so I think of Cooper, the Aaron. One of the things that was most pernicious about that is that working class whites felt like they were disassociated from the elite whites and forced to be with blacks. So it was a double injury. And Lonnie Grenier has written about that extensively. So I think we have to sort of deal with, so I liked Jonathan's 3 parts, only I would inverse it. Until we deal with the issue of race, we can't get to the other 2 things. It's actually foundational and formative in our society. It's not a side product. It's the whole thing of making nation, making race. And so how do we make a race, an identity that actually allows all of us to be involved and participate? And that's our project at the Othering and Belonging Institute. And all of you are welcome to join.
I love it. Okay, so this is great. Really enjoy. I really enjoyed the first 200 pages of your book. I think I'll enjoy the next 250. I'm really excited about this project. I want to reserve time, maybe during the question and answer, to raise what I think of as the racial capitalism challenge. It's a challenge that says maybe capitalism can't be saved because it's dependent upon the expropriation of labor, land, and natural resources. That's not going to be my comment. I'm actually going to sort of proceed from racialized mass incarceration as a way to engage with the conversation. I think it's an especially apt place to begin because I think the conversation about racialized mass incarceration helps us understand what happened to the New Deal. All right, and so that's I'm gonna get us through that, and then suggest that there's actually, with that sort of an analysis, there's actually some hope for particular strategies for building a multiracial, class-based, solidaristic movement. Okay, so what are the origins of racialized mass incarceration in the United States? When we think about Michelle Alexander's book, and especially her title, The New Jim Crow, the implication is that there's a sort of inexorable continuity from slavery to convict leasing and debt peonage to Jim Crow and then to the new Jim Crow. But in fact, that's not her argument. The middle of her book is dedicated to electoral politics. And in the context of electoral politics, she tells a story that goes like this. Barry Goldwater, in order to win the nomination in 1964, began to pick up on Southern language used to strip the status, to diminish the standing of civil rights activists. And that language was that civil rights activists weren't bold patriots fighting for their rights. They were ordinary criminals. And then the language of criminality is picked up in Congress in 1968. It's picked up by Nixon in 1968. Nixon wins in a massive landslide in 1972 by talking about law and order. Reagan picks up that same language. Bill Clinton can't figure out how to defeat it, so he actually imitates it. Likewise, Democratic members of Congress essentially look at the success of a language of law and order as a proxy language for racial resentment and say, we can't beat it, we've got to imitate it ourselves. And after the 1990s, you have both political parties competing in an upward bidding war to prove who can be most punitive in terms of building a massive carceral apparatus. I think that story continues through 2008, Barack Obama. Jonathan and I co-authored an unduly optimistic anthology. I co-edited Beyond the War on Crime. It's like, no. Obama didn't end the war on crime. I think he felt, and not because he was a racist, but because he understood that coded appeals to white racial resentment were the lingua franca of American electoral stand up against it. Not only that, but he felt that in order to insulate himself from attacks for being soft with respect to immigration, he would need to extend the machinery of mass incarceration to the immigration context and created the machinery of mass deportation we live under right now. So here's one version of that story. To understand racialized mass incarceration, you need to tell a story about American politics shifting in the 1960s to a new vocabulary, a coded racism that captured the white racial anxiety and that then shifted and completely realigned the American electoral politics. And in this story, so a couple of comments. One, no white candidate, no Democratic candidate for president wins after 1964 with the white vote. No Democratic candidate for president wins the white vote after 1964. Lots of things are happening in American politics, but race is central to the realignment of the parties. Second comment, this goes actually to Loïc a bit. If we look at the dynamics of mass incarceration today, there's a lot of great points about the sort of class aspect to it. I take a little bit of issue saying class, not race. Partly it's because I think it's a racial politics that's driving it. Partly because when you think about building a seemingly colorblind carceral system that is nevertheless animated by an effort to capture and strengthen white racial fear, race and class are necessarily going to overlap, right? They're always going to be imbricated. We know in terms of criminality that the biggest predictors of the commission of a crime are youth, masculinity, and economic precarity. We also know that in the United States, those things overlap with race, right? So to say, well, look at who the prisoners are, they're overwhelmingly defined by class. I agree. I'm taking a little bit of issue with comments like, so this is class, not race. Of course it's both. Okay, so one story I want to tell is here's the racialized origins in electoral politics of racialized mass incarceration. And it might seem as if what I'm doing is telling a story similar to Devon's. A story that says, let us focus now on what happens to communities of color. But I'm actually telling a different story. I'm actually saying, let us talk about what happened to all of the United States. Because Goldwater especially, Goldwater's aim is not white dominance. Goldwater's aim is to dismantle the New Deal. When Reagan campaigns on the crime issue, he also campaigns against the welfare queen. When Clinton picks up the language of crime, he also says, we must end welfare as a way of life. The move to use race as a new language of American politics was a strategy of political economy. It was a strategy to convince the many, the white voters, that the dangerous few in their lives were not the few identified by Teddy Roosevelt or Lyndon Johnson, that the dangerous few in their lives were violent and undeserving people of color. And it's a strategy that worked. So if you want to trace the lines of mass incarceration, the upward tick in the incarceration of communities of color, that line parallels rising wealth inequality in the United States. I'd put it this way. The single most important weapon in the class war the rich have been winning for the last 50 years is anti-Black racism. I'm going to say it again, but this time backwards. Anti-Black racism is the single most important weapon in the class war the rich have been winning and continued. And now this is where I'm going to channel, like, I feel like this panel, we're all like the stock characters at an academic seminar where somebody's presenting their book and everybody then says, I have a question and a comment. My comment is, have you read my book? And my question is, what do you think about my book? Right, so I'm just going to join it. So, but the subtitle of this book, How Coded Racial Appeals Have Reinvented Racism and Wrecked the Middle Class. Like, the race strategy in American politics is a class strategy. So I want to say that. Now I want to say, and in a way, there's some good news. And I want to see if we can highlight, well, this is the bad news slide. I will get to the good news slide in a second. This is the bad news slide. So after I published Dog Whistle Politics, I started working with unions and foundations to say, how can we translate this insight of racism as a class weapon into something actionable in terms of building a cross-racial, class-based solidarity? One of the things we did is we tested the efficacy of the right-wing racial fear. And you should notice that it's super effective, right? Like, if you're looking at that, this is a dial test. Anything above 50 is people saying, yeah, we like this message. We feel warmly towards it. Notice there's no big difference by racial group. Americans as a whole are convinced by the seemingly race-neutral story that says we are beset by criminals and undeserving welfare cheats, illegal immigrants, and also terrorists, that they are a threat to the good, hardworking, decent, tax-paying Americans who embody the values of the heartland, right? Like, all of that language, it's all dog whistling. It is not blatant racism, right? You can see it in terms of how people are responding. And one thing to note, between 2016 and 2020, the share of the vote received by Donald Trump, the share of the African-American, Latino, and Asian American Donald Trump went up. Right? Like, as egregious as he was, he won more support from, right? So this isn't just a white problem. This is an American problem. There's like the power of this racialized story. Okay, so next slide, if I can do it. Can you, oh, even better. Nope. Nope. Yeah, that one. Okay, the place to start with this slide, I took the results of the dog whistle story, right, the racial fear story, and set that to 0. So that's the baseline. And what you're seeing is two different messages and their efficacy compared to the racial fear story, right? And the one in the green, that's the standard racial justice message. That might be, and in fact, it's a more moderate version of the abolitionist story, but it's a story, I can share the message later, but it's a message that basically says our country is shot through with racism. It has devastating structural impacts on communities of color. We need to repair the racism that besets and bedevils our country and communities of color. Shocking news, white people hate that message, right? And so you can see, and then you might also look at persuadables, all races, right? And we can talk about who the persuadables are, but short answer, that's 60% of the voting public that you can't win unless you carry. They don't like this message either. The green message works against that 0 line among Latinos and African Americans. I should say this was done in the summer of 2020 at the height of the sort of George Floyd protest. So this is the high watermark for racial justice messages. Okay. There's a message that's in blue right? That blue line. A couple of things that are significant about the blue line. It's the most popular message among African Americans. It's the most popular message among Latinos. It wins among persuadable voters, right? And again, this is compared to the 0, which is the right-wing racial fear message. Here's something that's truly remarkable. It wins among white voters. I know of no other message about, and this is specifically with respect to criminal justice reform, I know of no other criminal justice reform that wins among white voters head to head against a racial fear message. So now, the criminal justice message. I think it's 3 slides. Criminal justice. It doesn't matter what race or ethnicity you are. We all know that growing up in a healthy neighborhood helps our children to thrive. But certain politicians describe some communities as basically criminal. Then they divert needed resources to pay mainly for police and prisons. Stoking fear seems like a strategy for these politicians to avoid taking responsibility for the decisions they're making, especially the things they do for their big money donors. When we reject messages of fear and division and join together with people from all walks of life, we can elect new leaders who will ensure all our communities get better schools, not more barbed wire, and more jobs, not more jails. This message, there's a lot going on here. Essentially what this message does is it says, they divide to conquer, we unite to build. And it changes the story of race we're telling. It changes the racists from white people in general and white society in general to the greedy billionaires who strategically stoke racism so that they can divide us and laugh all the way to the bank. And likewise, it changes the basis for racial solidarity from an argument that we should engage in solidaristic politics in order to help communities of color to the message that we should engage in solidaristic politics to save our own damn family. Because every one of us, including white people, are at risk from anti-Black racism, right? Like that's the strategy. I could almost say a whole book about it. Again, the subtitle, fusing race and class, and then the modest claim, winning elections and saving America. Let me bring this back. I'm just going to sum up here. Let me bring it back to in the first 200 pages, at least. And then in this morning's conversation, the law and political economy conversation has really been about the political economy, about the nature of the economy. Whereas the book is very clear that it's saying we need to also think about democracy and the constitution of democracy. And I think the challenge here for the LPE community is that actually the democratic work, the work to build an inclusive we may be a prerequisite. Actually, I'll take out the maybe, because what the heck, I've already written a book saying that's not maybe. It is a prerequisite to effective organizing around the economy. The very device used to destroy broad political support for the New Deal was an effort to destroy the notion of who the we are, to stoke social divisiveness and social strife. We cannot restore support for class-based politics unless we build a capacious sense of an American we that includes people of color and other groups that are being politically demonized for profit. So this is gender, this is abortion politics, this is trans politics. Unless you can build an inclusive politics that includes these folks in a sense of the we, you cannot build sufficient popular support to win economic justice. That's the challenge for the LPE community. The challenge for this panel is subtitled CRT meets LPE, right? So in terms of the CRT meets LPE aspect, the challenge for the critical race theory folks is building that sense of we might not be able to lead with equality, because equality is a demand on whites that many whites interpret as a taking away from them and an imputation of blame. we may need to lead with other constitutional values, in particular the constitutional value of we the people, or e pluribus unum, or the central prerequisite to a successful democracy that the nation state inculcate a sense of social solidarity among the citizenry, right? And this is a challenge, I think, for the CRT folks, because we want to lead with equality, lead with anti-racism. I'll stop there.
Oh, or belonging.
Or belong, right? Yes. No. I would actually say I would actually say John's work, leading with belonging, is the we the people, right? Is the we must, like at the level of government, at the level of schools, at the level of unions, we must develop a practice of purposefully building social solidarity. And I understand othering and belonging and John's work very much in that vein.
Well, there's a ton of important and provocative ideas here, and I want to open up to this very patient audience. But let me pick up one strand that's come up and ask you all to opine on it briefly. And that is the place of abolition. A couple people have named it. But looking at a long arc of constitutionalism, it's hard not to see abolition as deeply resonant, right? I mean, and indeed, modern abolitionism in the penal industrial complex sense pretty much dates from Du Bois and his critique of how Reconstruction's demise had been understood. He talked about it as the moment when there was an experiment in building an American democracy that was crushed. And so for him, abolition, and then Angela Davis picks this up, is always intertwined with creating a more democratic society, a more democratic system. So I want to ask it this way: to what extent should those of us in the progressive LPE community embrace and center abolitionism when it comes to thinking about the carceral state? And to what extent can abolitionists find advantages and strengths in embracing a broader LPE perspective in situating what abolition means for the future? And I'll ask each of you to maybe just go back in the order that we spoke, if you have any comments on that.
We should start from that end.
All right, that's true.
No, you should start from that end.
Nobody asked you to open it up. Start with Loïc.
No, I want to hear what other.
I'll start. So I want to start actually with the point that Ian made. And I say to my staff and students all the time, don't confuse analysis with communication. So sometimes we have an analysis that's spot on. And I think abolition is one of those examples, but it doesn't or equality, right? The analysis might be spot on, but that doesn't mean that's how you lead. I think how you lead ultimately, without abandoning your values, is empirical. You're in a conversation with people. You say something. I mean, all of us maybe have been in relationships, and we say something, and our partner says, "That was effed up," and you say, "No, you misunderstood me." So, "Well, that's what you said." "No, that's not what I meant." And yet in this area, oftentimes it's like we want to be righteous. I want to say what I say, and if you misunderstand it, you're an asshole. So I think we have to be a little more sophisticated than that. Be clear on our goals, clear on our values, but also clear on the conversation that we have with other people. And part of that's empirical. I'm trying to see if Paul is still here. The political scientists need to help us with this. Again, it's not saying abandon your values, being strategic, test it. So it may sound good to me and Devon and may drive other people up the wall. So I think we have to be a little more sophisticated.
I would reiterate that it's pretty clear that abolitionism and also demands for reparations will never succeed legislatively. So then the question is, why engage in that? And I think you can't understand why people are abolitionists or strident proponents of reparations without understanding the underlying analysis. I don't know that there are many people who think reparations or abolition is going to succeed. When you ask them why they're engaged in it, they say active nation, active critique. We have to have a vision of a different world that's possible, all of which are ways of saying this isn't possible, this isn't likely, this isn't going to happen. I think what's happening is, and I'll situate myself within this, many racial justice folks for a very long time have been operating within a framework in which racism is fundamentally a white over non-white dynamic. And from within that framework, you then move pretty quickly to a pessimistic politics because you say racism is fundamentally white over non-white. White people retain the preponderance of economic, political, and cultural power in the country. There is an interest divergence. White people have an interest in maintaining white racism. And therefore, you come to someplace similar to where Derek Bell ended up. Racism is permanent. What then can you do? Protest in an angry, sort of denunciatory fashion, but without real hope of winning reform at an electoral level. You can also withdraw, right? You can also separate. You can say, well, we can have justice within our communities, but not for the broader country. Now, here's where I want to clarify in terms of my own remarks. I think that I sort of ended with, here's the rhetoric, here's the way to talk about it that is compelling. But I want to insist that that rhetoric is also based on a particular analysis that we should recover. Du Bois, I think, and others in the sort of Black radical tradition understood more clearly than many people do, though we're shifting back, that racism and capitalism arose together and continue to be inseparable. And from that point of view, racism is not fundamentally white over non-white hierarchy. Racism is fundamentally a tool for pursuing power that succeeds to the extent it promotes white over non-white hierarchy. The white over non-white hierarchy is there. It's important. It's devastating. But you have to look behind it to see that it's a tool of power. And once you look behind it, and this comes to something that Jon says, you can see that the wages of whiteness have shifted from 1868 to 1968 to 1923. That the possibility of a cross-racial solidaristic economically just movement today is rooted in part on the fact that nothing has cost white people more over the last 50 years than clinging to whiteness as a basis for organizing their social and political lives. Right? Like the wages of whiteness for white people, if you could get them to, are decisively negative over the last half century. So the analysis that I think we're moving towards, that you see in racial capitalism, that perhaps we're going to begin to see more of in LPE, is an analysis that says what we're up against is power, and in the United States, power has organized itself most effectively in terms of organizing group hatreds, especially racial hatred. If we're going to have any chance to protect our families, whatever race we are, we need to organize the sort of the power of the many against the few, which requires cross-racial solidarity, right? That has to be the move.
There's a lot going on in my head, so I'm going to try and just sort it out. I think it's clearly important that we think about the rhetorical register in which we make arguments for pragmatic reasons. So the way I sometimes say it to my students, that, you can't, if you're in court, say, that's the dumbest, most racist thing I've heard, Chief Justice Roberts. I mean, you might have that view, but that's not presumably what you're going to say. So I think we should all be on the same page with respect to the need to think about articulating a view in multiple anti-racist registers. That's A. I don't think that the question about engaging abolitionism should stop at the question of efficacy, because I think that many of the policy initiatives that were unthinkable, the fact that we're having a conversations about reparations, the fact that it's on the table, the fact that legislators are supposed to deal with it, has to do with the fact that you're not always acquiescing in the terms of the debate. The right doesn't do that. I mean, every new rhetorical move creates a condition of possibility for something else. So I do think that what we're trying to do, presumably, is not just reflect the existing rhetorical terms of the debate, but restructure them. And if some things are already unspeakable at the outset, then I don't really see that condition of possibility. In relationship to that, I will say that there were particular ways of talking about race that were absolutely palatable. So let's think about some of these terms. Equality wasn't always a dirty word. That was at one moment the darling way to talk about it. Think about the genealogy of implicit bias. Let's all talk about that. What was so palatable. Now that's like a radical thing that's right there with critical race theory. It's right there. You have implicit bias and CRT. So there's a way in which particular devices for naming particular realities becomes dirtied early by the right and jettisoned too quickly by the left. So I'm down with thinking very strategically about how we talk about what we talk about. If I'm engaging, certain institutions, I'm not going to leave in an abolitionist register. That's just not what I'm going to do. And I think I said as a point of departure, I don't fully imagine that all the way down. So I'm not the one to even defend this. But I worry again about it not being seriously engaged by us, not just as a modality of analysis, but as a thing that moves in ways that create conditions of possibility for other things. And so I'm trying to channel people who have thought deeply about this, like you mentioned, Amna Akbar, and others who are trying to push a particular conversation that I think we should create some space to have.
So I'm afraid I'm going to throw a big bucket of cold water on the audience and disappoint people. But based on observation in the penal trenches, I have come reluctantly to the view that abolition is good for moral philosophizing and for academic debates, but it just doesn't connect with reality. And at the end of the day, we have to change reality. Where the rubber hits the road, I think the talk of abolition is creating a backlash. This backlash is already there. Reform prosecutors that won elections in the last round, some of them have been recalled. San Francisco prosecutor has been recalled. There was a recall move in LA that failed, but barely. Right now in this county, there's movement afoot to recall Pamela Price. And I think we may be on the eve of a tremendous backlash. And we have to be careful how we tread and how we move forward.
Thank you all very, very much, and for your patience. So let's open it up now. And if you just microphone to you, and if there's more than one people that want to speak, we can collect a couple. So let's start with Diana.
Hi, thank you all for this. This was incredible. My question is how to think about workers employed in the carceral state. I think it's a really important LPE issue that it doesn't seem to get the attention that I would want it to. My understanding at the latest numbers is, 1.5% of the American workforce is employed in some way in the carceral system. And so I think that raises two kind of big questions. Well, one, to the extent some of those workers are organized in opposition to reforms, how do we think about that? How do we engage with that? But then secondly, I think, more normatively for, those of us who are concerned about good jobs, how do we think about what we want for those workers? And how does that become part of the conversation?
Fantastic. Does somebody want to raise another point, and then we'll go back to our panel? Everyone. Here we go.
I sort of share Devon's views across the board. I'm not the person to articulate these thoughts, but also that I think, and I just want to push forward a slight corrective for people who are thinking about the movement for abolition, and to say that when I hear movement actors talk about abolition on the streets and in community meetings, they're not talking about getting rid of police. They're talking about transforming what the police is into a different type of community safety mechanism. And so I think that there's a way in which abolition has captured our imaginations, maybe in these conversations, that actually departs from the way that movement actors actually talk about it.
Why don't we go to our, on that? I have to say, picking up a little bit on Devon's point about the police power, I like to ask my students, do you want to abolish the police or the police power? And if it's the police power, what part of it? Can we use our power over civil to regulate industry to, if you look at the police power in the 19th century, it's often about protecting the well-being of the community through regulating markets, through other kinds of controls. So both on the carceral workforce and about the point about community activists, let me open it up to any of you.
Go ahead, Devon.
No, I was going to say, I do think there are various articulations of the idea. So it's not a one thing. And the only other thing I would say, part of the difficulty for me is that I don't know a moment in which there isn't backlash. That is to say, Reconstruction was backlash. I don't know a moment in which maybe someone can point it out to me where the US or any particular comes together in interracial harmony. Oh, we're going to do this thing, as distinct from some state intervention against majoritarian will. So I don't know where the historical evidence is that there's a right argument that just gets the state or gets people to quote unquote do the right thing. We need to recognize how movements have led to shifts rather than somehow 70% of the population is just anti-racist down and produces Brown or produces Reconstruction or it's always been politics, contestation, war, etc., coercion, and it's complicated in all of those ways, which doesn't mean that we don't think carefully about how we say what we say, but it means that trying to think about this against the backdrop of whether there's backlash, I think proves too much.
With respect to, so I agree with a lot of what Devon's saying, and I think that it's very important to be proactive about the sort of rhetoric we use, be strategic about our claims. I think it actually really behooves us to look very carefully at the particular reforms, or even radical reforms being asked for. One of the things that strikes me is that with respect both to reparations and to abolitionism, is that the substantive content could be argued for in very different ways. So for example, if abolition means a completely different approach to public order, safety, the provision of important services like mental health services, there's so one could argue for those things by saying this is part of the process by which we take care of we the people, or you could say this is what abolition means. One of the problems with the rhetoric of abolition and the rhetoric of reparations is that it is grounded in a hard-hitting racial analysis that says it is white racism that is driving police violence, and therefore abolition. It is white racism that is driving anti-immigrant mass deportation, and therefore abolish ICE. It is white racism that is responsible for the structural disadvantage of the Black community, and therefore reparations. That frame energizes activists and fails in terms of, and I want to be super clear about this, it fails in speaking to white people, and it fails in speaking to most people in communities. And this was really a shock to me when I tested this. But outside of the activist class, most people of color do not want to hear a story in which White racism is pervasive, has been ongoing for centuries, is backed by the great majority of white people, as well as the government, and the odds are completely stacked against their children. Like, it just, like, I mean, I can speak from personal experience. My mother, that was inconceivable that she, is a brown-skinned immigrant from El Salvador, arrived here to lock her child into a racist system, right? So we as activists have developed a story of rampant white racism that analytically has a lot to say for it, but also really limits our political efficacy outside of our own circles. And now this is to make a distinction between the frame we're using and the particular things we're asking for. Same with respect to reparations. Many of the things, like if you took a look at the 2016 Democratic candidates, 2020 Democratic candidates, as sort of, articulating support for reparations, and yet what they meant was, right, things like universal programs that invested in all communities. It's like, well, all that reparations, you could call that a universal program to lift the American people, right? So part of it is to really think about the frame. But I just want to reiterate this point. The frames are powerful because they're tapping into paradigmatic models of racism that we're drawing on. And I really do think, and I'll personalize this, through the vast bulk of my career, my paradigmatic model of racism was white over non-white hierarchy. And I didn't even know that was my model. I just kept drawing on it right up until the Obama administration. And then I was like, glory days are here. And then they weren't. And then I was like, this is about power, and power as it effectuates itself through racism. And Diana asked a really great question. It's a super challenging question. One part of the question is, how do we think about the numbers of workers in the carceral system or in the sort of state security system? They are very, very strong supporters of racially reactionary politics, because A, it supplies them jobs, and B, it helps them rationalize the jobs they're doing. They are empowered, they are vociferous, they are politically active. They have hamstrung the ability of unions union federations like the AFL-CIO to be more progressive on the basis of race. It's a huge problem. The question is also challenging when we ask, where do we think they would go if we began to dismantle this carceral systems? I just wanted to this is me saying, yeah, great question.
Anyone else want to pick up on that?
My remark will be brief. I will hide behind René Descartes and his motto, which is Larvatus Prodeo, masked, I advance.
John?
So I've enjoyed the discussion, and I don't want to ruin it by saying too much. We did a study on the issue of abolitionists. First of all, I agree with virtually everything Devon said, and yet I still think there's a underlying tension that I want to lift up. I think sometimes you do stake out a position and you're clear what you're doing is staking out a position. You're not trying to win in the short or even medium term. Or sometimes you're just like, I don't give a shit. I'm going to say something. It's going to piss you off. I'm going to say it anyway because I need to say it. That's okay. But if you're saying it thinking that it's going to win you the election, it's going to pull your candidate over the finish line, then you need to know, is it going to do that or not? And in the middle of the fight around abolition or not, I got contacted by organizers and activists, and they were split, both Black groups, national groups, and they were split, and they were both, in a sense, looking for the same finish line, but their tactics were very different. What the organizers felt like is that the activists weren't tied to the Black community. They felt like the activists, Black activists, were largely tied to the elite and the white community. They weren't speaking for the Black community. And they were about to go public. This is about to be a big public fight. And they came to us, and I appreciated the fact that they trusted us enough. And they said, help us negotiate this. And so what we suggested was doing a survey where we oversampled the Black community, especially in the Twin Cities area, because a lot of us come out of there, and we just share with them what the results were. And the results was what Ian suggested. And it was interesting because if you describe what you wanted, accountability, more healthcare services, there was support from every community, the Black community, the white community, Latino community, Asian community, conservatives, liberals. But if you framed it in terms of abolition, it changed. It was almost support from no community. Not the Black community didn't support it, Latino community supported it, white community didn't support it. So to your point, it's like you don't get a chance, and I say this to my students, like you don't get it's like you write a paper and you say, this is what I really meant. You write a paper, the paper has to stand on its own. You can't follow it around interpreting to people. So if everyone's drawing something different than what you want, you need to think about that. Now you may say they're all idiots, or they're all racist, or I don't care, but you need to have that information. And with that information, what they did, they decided not to take the fight public. But I'm not saying some point you don't do that. I mean, again, I think sometimes you move the conversation. Like when people were saying, I mean, a lot of people excused Lincoln, right? They said, he couldn't say he was an abolitionist. Okay, maybe not. I mean, I was reading for this panel. There are a lot of people, historians say he really was down, but he was being practical. Somebody sometimes needs to be radical, needs to be outside the mainstream. But too often, and I'm not saying we shouldn't push back from the right or whatever, too often we frame issues in such a way that people who are not right or left can't get into the conversation. And so I literally was on calls where people would say, I don't know about this abolitionist. And people would say, then you're not down with the people. They wouldn't explain it. It was just like, you have to be there. It was, so I think we have to be really careful and sophisticated. And we have to have more than one voice. There are an array of us, and we have different roles. And I think we have to sort of respect that. Tell you one last story, and I know, so here in the Bay Area, there was a big public demonstration on abolish the police. Groups called me up who were pushing abolish the police. They called me up. Will you speak at our rally? We expect a couple of thousand people. Could you speak? And I said, do you want me to speak? And they say, yeah. And I said, so my position is a little bit nuanced. I talk about complicated stories. I do think we need complicated. I think sometimes we frame things so they're not complicated. We think that that's cool or that's energize our base, but it leaves a lot out. So I said, I can speak, but this is what I'm going to say. I'm going to talk about some of the underlying things. I'm going to talk about we need reform. We'll talk about what people are, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to talk about it's different in different communities. There's not one national position. Position in Minnesota and position in Orange County might be different. And I said, I can't categorically say I support that frame or categorically oppose it. It depends. And they said, we know. And they said, and when you say that publicly, we might take exception. We might challenge you, but people need to hear that. And I thought that was incredibly sophisticated. They're saying there can be some tension publicly. And once we get in public, we act like we don't know you. I said, that's fine. Don't hit me.
I just want to add one complicating point about backlash, and then we'll go to some more comments here. And that is, here I want to bring in the great work of Khalil Muhammad, and especially the book, The Condemnation of Blackness, because I think what you miss in between like redemption and the war on crime is the role, it's same Lochner era, right, is eugenics and the framing of Blackness and crime as one thing. And amazingly, this happens before Black people are even living in urban America. 99% of them are in the rural South, while these early eugenicists are talking about the, quote, traits of the Negro race as being inextricably bound up with crime. And I think as a result, any move to increase rights for Black people creates not just a backlash, but a fear of crime backlash, a desire for greater punishment. And in fact, at the height of the second Reconstruction, the sociologist Hubert Blaylock framed the racial threat hypothesis as basically a way of articulating that politicians will naturally turn to punishment and other forms of law and order as a way to reassure white publics once there's any increase in either Black demography or Black power. Now, I saw a couple of hands in the back. Jay, let me bring this up to you.
Thanks. Yeah, my question is sort of in the spirit of some of the comments, including the ones that John just made, but I wanted to ask about how it can help us to, whether it can help us to think more about the state of organizing and organizations in this country. This is kind of a political science, Paul Pearson point, that we've seen a big decline in the types of organizations that often mediated our politics. So decline of labor unions, decline of other. And it strikes me that one of the things that happens with the lack of these kinds of places, and John's talking about some good examples of where this works, but I think that still there's a big deficit here. That, but then in addition to that, there's a lot of distrust and lack of engagement between certain elites, like in Washington, like Democratic Party elites, for instance, where there's a lot of distrust between popular groups and people doing around, et cetera. There's also the problem of foundations getting involved, and like thinking like Jane McAlevey has this distinction between organizing and mobilizing, and foundations will often fund mobilizing but less deep organizing type stuff. And so it strikes me that there's a dynamic that happens with issues like defund the police or abolish ICE, where there's a really important issue that is becoming very salient. And then there is this disconnect where we don't have organizations and organic intellectuals and all this, what people are experiencing and wanting on the ground, and then getting that up to the elite level. And then it seems that now what happens is there's a this vacuum forms, and then it's filled by things like Twitter, et cetera. So then like these slogans like abolish ICE come from Twitter, right? And I don't think abolish ICE for most people meant we will have no immigration bureaucracy at all. It just means we won't have the one that I think most people thought we don't want to have this particular militarized form that has all these organizational problems. And but then the Republicans are like, this is, but once it's out on Twitter, once it goes viral, then the question goes to the politicians. It's like, do you want to abolish ICE? Yes or no? And if they say no, then all of a sudden they're against, the popular demand. But then once they say I'm for it, then all of a sudden it becomes an attack point from the right. And I see this as a failure of, or like the poverty of our, organizational infrastructure on the progressive side in the United States. And I think that the other side of this is that we also don't have good ways of talking about the problems, like within the policing and ICE, et cetera, because, I have in the last 10 years, I've spent a lot of time explaining US policing to people in other countries. And one thing that I think is really important to understand is that in countries like in Western Europe or East Asia, you'll have a Ministry of Justice that sets out national standards for use of force and escalation, et cetera, that then control how policing in the entire country works. While in the United States, we have 20,000 distinct police departments. Plus, then you have unions that organize across all of these departments to diminish standards. And so then you get kind of a situation that looks like, kind of like 19th century gangs in a lot of police departments. And this is the, and so this is the other side of this. So I think that the focusing on what's going on with organizing and organizations is really important here. And I think that's some of what you've been touching on, but I just wanted to put that on the table and see if there are any thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, very quick. I just was wondering what you think about the role. We've been talking about sort of political actors and the people and how the sort of rhetoric between them. But I'm wondering about the media and their role in sort of shaping these debates, particularly with recently, I think there's been increasing attention to media practices in terms of crime reporting, basically just co-opting the statements of the police and police spokespeople. Yeah, propaganda, exactly. And so I guess just, and it's obviously tied to broader issues related to our political economy. So just wondering if anyone has thoughts on that.
So third hand, did you want to make a comment or a question over here? Okay, that was just so back to our, there we go. We passed. And then we'll go back to our panel.
This kind of goes off Professor Powell and Professor Haney-Lopez's points of building an inclusive we. I find it to be a really compelling idea. I was wondering if you could speak to sort of the other side of that, how you understand the sort of historically more problematic they aspect of that, and how you view a sort of responsible way to go about that in building that inclusive we.
Thank you. We've got about 10 more minutes and then we have a snack break. So let's go back when people need sugar and caffeine, definitely. So let's go back to our panel because that stimulates too. Ian, you want to start us off?
I think the point about, I think the point about the decline of civic organizations is very important. I would respond by saying, here's the core insight I'm advancing. The way forward depends upon purposefully building social solidarity. And now I think what's happened on the center left is that we've given up on social solidarity for the last 50 years. White people gave up on integration. Communities of color gave up on integration. We've moved to a sort of a siloed politics in which we're define our political communities by the hierarchies we're fighting. Whether at the, I mean, universities are doing a little bit better than this, but by and large, from the universities to the foundations to labor unions to churches, we do not, to state and local government, we don't do nearly enough to identify social solidarity as a primary goal of all of our efforts, right? So I would say that the media question is such a great question. I think one way to think about what's happening to us is to realize that some of the most powerful people in the nation have put their will and money behind social strife. And by the most powerful people, I mean the Republican Party, but I also mean the dark money billionaire Koch donor network. But I also mean an incredibly sophisticated propaganda network, Roger Ailes, Fox, social media and big data, the whole Cambridge Analytica, Steve Bannon, the amount of power, resources, skill going into driving social strife here and internationally is unbelievable. And we're just barely starting to talk about it. The inclusive we conversation, it's a really great conversation. It's a really big one. To me, it takes, I'd reframe it this way. Why might we build cross-racial solidarity that includes white people now when Martin Luther King couldn't do it in 67, when the Reconstruction era couldn't do it in 1867? Why now? And that's really a conversation about, I mean, it's a big conversation, but it's a conversation about how race has changed, how racism is being used as a class weapon, about the shifting position of whites. I'd say two quick answers that really actually pick up on Jon's challenge. Forward progress depends upon engaging whiteness. How might we engage whiteness? Two ways. One, communicate to people constructed as white that there are other identities available to primary in their lives. And two, begin to articulate an emancipatory whiteness, a whiteness that allows people to say, yes, I'm white. And to be white means to be committed to these essential values of social solidarity, cross-racial solidarity, joining together across lines of division to stand up for everybody's family, right? This is, be purposeful about creating new understandings of what whiteness means. Can we do it now in 2023? If I know. But I do know that if we don't, right, like we stand on the cusp of authoritarianism, of mass violence, of vast and enduring economic inequality, and on the cusp of climate collapse. All of that depends upon, resolution of all of that depends upon the ability of the vast majority of us to bring the government of the United States back onto the side of the vast majority of Americans. And that in turn depends on a new sort of robust social solidarity.
Let me add a couple of things after that, sort of hopeful comments by my friend and colleague. Things are bad, but they're not hopeless. First of all, we've done this in the past. Think about the EU, 1957. I mean, Europe, which is a made-up concept in and of itself, but every 5 minutes they were fighting each other. There were jokes about, Germans in war, and the idea that the French and Germans are now friends and allies is actually, if you're going back to 1947, 1950, it would have been unthinkable. Unthinkable. They deliberately took that on. Can we construct a super identity? You don't have to stop being French or German, but you can be European. And if we do it right, we won't kill each other. So it's not a complete secret. I mean, nation building is about making identities. So let's take that on. And our identities are changing all the time. Before World War II, a Polish American and a German American would not marry. They lived in different neighborhoods, had different churches, had different newspapers. It's the suburbanization of America after World War II that created a new super white identity that now most people think is just natural. And it's happened over and over again. South Africa, it took South Africa years to mount an effective fight against the Dutch and English because the South African, who we call Blacks, their salient identity was tribal. It was not Blackness. Steve Biko deliberately talked about the Black consciousness movement of making Black the salient identity in South Africa in opposition to whiteness. And he succeeded primarily. He was killed sort of, unfortunately, in jail, but he largely succeeded. After apartheid was formally dismantled, there's still stuff there. South Africa's a hot mess, but the tribal identity starts to reemerge. So, I mean, I'm teaching a class now about identity formation. It happens all the time. And whenever we're in an identity, it looks natural, it looks inevitable. We can't imagine it's changing. It's changing right now. If I could find my passport, excuse me, not my passport, my birth certificate from 1947 when I was born, it would say colored on it. It wouldn't say Negro, it wouldn't say Black, it wouldn't say African American, it would say color. We were colored in 1947. Malcolm X was the first public figure to declare himself Black. And people were like, he called himself Black. Don't do that, because Black had been a pejorative term. He turned into a political term. And it took Thurgood Marshall a decade to come to terms with being Black. He said, I'm a Negro. I'm not Black. I'm not African American. I'm a Negro. And what I'm saying is that our identities are changing. And sometimes the elite are very deliberate about changing our identities. So it's not hopeless. I mean, part of it is that the non-elite usually are the result of this. They don't think about it constructively. They just take it on. So I'm saying we have to think about it constructively. I could say a lot more in terms of two examples. Almost all the organizing networks now do something called deep canvassing. Deep canvassing is bridging, and bridging works. There's studies out showing that deep canvassing is more than 100 times effective than general persuasion. And what is deep canvassing? The short part of it is you go to someone, instead of saying, what party are you registered for? Are you going to vote? Here's my issue. Thanks, right? That's traditional canvassing, about 90 seconds, 2 minutes. Deep canvassing is like saying, Ian, how are you doing today? How's your family? What issues are of concern to you? You connect with the person. It takes an hour, it takes 45 minutes. Excuse me, but it works. And so part of what everyone needs now, everyone wants in our society, is to be seen, to be cared about. And the group that feels most othered, because it's not even just race, it's because you get this kind of construction, if you're in India, is being a Muslim. If you're in South Africa, it's race and ethnicity. If you're someplace else, so that's why we call it othering. It's not just race, but if you engage people and they feel seen, something happens. And so that's the bridging. That's what deep canvassing is. It's the time to take. How to do this at scale, we don't entirely know, but we can. And part of what happens, and I'll stop after this, is that when we call someone the other, we flatten them. It's like, okay, they're Jewish. That's all I need to know. I need to know, do they have children? Are they rich? Are they poor? They're Jewish. and I'm not, or they're Palestinian, I'm not, or they're white and I'm not. You know, we have no, and if they're defined as the other, not only do we flatten, we have no empathy for them. Bob Marley said, every man thinks his burden is the heaviest. So I can't see your burden because you're white. All I see is privilege. And it might be that you have a serious disability. It might be that any number of things. So it's the ability, it's not saying you skip all the structural stuff, but it's not hopeless. And the last thing on social media. Yeah, I mean, social media, we need a new story. And I'll leave you with this, a hopeful note, maybe. I don't think hope is the right thing to organize around. But we can spread information very fast to the whole world. So not just for negative, but for good. We haven't been thoughtful about it. How do we tell a new story that actually brings all of us into this new we? And again, it may seem like impossible. But two quick examples. Jesus, right? 2,000 years ago, no one was Christian. Today, 2 billion people call themselves Christian. Jesus changed the world, and he did it without the internet. I'll stop.
Folks,